Okay, this is part 5 of Robert Temple's A New Science of Heaven book that I've been reading through, and we're going to be on chapter 10 tonight, and hopefully get through a couple of chapters, but we'll see. Let's see what we got here. Chapter 10, Invisible Earth. There is an Earth that is invisible to the human eye, and it surrounds the visible planet Earth. This other Earth is composed of plasma, and it is far larger than the solid core, quote unquote, on which we live. Which then is the real Earth? Or is the real Earth both together? The invisible Earth was only discovered in 1958 thanks to satellite data by James Van Allen, 1914 to 2006. When James Van Allen's portrait appeared on the cover of America's Time magazine on the 4th of May, 1959, with the news banner "Space and the Radiation Belt" angled across the top, he became an instant American hero. He had discovered something called radiation belts, quote unquote, surrounding the Earth. Few people until then had any inkling that the Earth was protected from the solar wind by these shields or belts, quote unquote, surrounding it. But then, prior to 1953, neither had any scientists. As for Time, the following year, they did indeed name him America's Man of the Year, quote unquote, for 1960, thus increasing his fame. And in case there was anybody left who had not yet heard of him, which was doubtful. Inside the magazine, Time helpfully provided graphics that both recounted the sequence of discoveries and showed the now famous belts, quote unquote. This sequence of graphics was headed Space Detective Story to help everybody realize that it was only slowly and painfully discovered by intensive research stemming from rocket and satellite launches. The graphic sequence was divided into 4 boxes. Box 1 said, quote, 1953 raccoons, small solid fuel sounding rockets fired in the atmosphere after becoming detached from a balloon. After that, rather than fired from the ground. Fired off Newfoundland to detect first hint of radiation belt, end quote. The picture showed a small red arrow pointing into space from Newfoundland in Canada. Box 2 said, quote, 1958, explorers 1 and 3 find lower portion of inner belt, end quote. The picture shows the inner belt in cross-section above the Earth and informs us that it is 2,000 miles thick. Box 3 says 1958 Project Argus demonstrates charged particles follow magnetic lines of force. End quote. Uh-oh. Even though magnetic lines of force are not real. So what's it actually doing? Something similar. Like Temple said, it's mistaking the map for the territory with these magnetic field lines or lines of force. Anyways, Project Argus involved exploding atomic BOMBs, almost said it, above the Earth, and the picture without the slightest embarrassment at this shows an exploding red star above the Earth labeled atomic explosions, quote unquote, and red lines showing the charged particles from these explosions circulating around the Earth. with the orbit of another satellite also indicated, which says, quote, Explorer 4 measures results, end quote. And finally, box 4 says December 1958, Pioneer 3 reaches 63,000 miles, establishes second radiation belt, end quote. And the picture shows this, labels it outer radiation belt, quote unquote, indicates that it is 10,000 miles above the first belt. And there is a further arrow surrounded by dots that is called leakage of particles, quote unquote. And here's the pictures. Box 1, doopy doop. There's the belt, the first one, 1,000 miles. There's the exothermic reactions. And there's the second one, which is like way bigger than the first one. Like, holy cows. Figure 19, Time Magazine's explanatory chart by V. Puglisi. Man, I'm butchering this name. Puglisi. I don't know. I'm not doing well tonight on names. Of the discovery of the Van Allen belts, the bottom picture shows how much bigger the second outer belt is than the first. A third higher belt was discovered later. Notes the shameless boasting of the atomic exothermic reaction, quote unquote, in the picture above, the bottom one, complete with a helpful red exothermic reaction. How incredibly naive, or should I say stupid, the military authorities were, and how idiotic the editors of Time have been to print this without any indication that they had turned their brains on and realized that maybe this was possibly not such a good idea. Yeah, I mean, hindsight's 2020, right? Or maybe there's something else involved there. Who knows? Thus did the public get their necessary basic science lesson and see what it was that Van Allen had discovered. There was a lengthy article to explain it all much further and to describe the man himself. The magazine informed everyone, quote, in the race into space, the Russians can claim bigger satellites and more powerful rockets. If the US can retort that it has a big lead in scientific achievement, then the man most responsible is James Van Allen, whose instruments, designed and largely constructed in his basement laboratory, brought back from space discoveries the Russians never made. I don't know. That seems kind of shifty. He's making equipment in a supposed basement laboratory. Well, basement of what building, though? Probably in the military-industrial complex basement. Who knows? Maybe the whole story, maybe the Time magazine elaborates it somewhere else, but probably not. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. Back to the quote. But Van Allen never expected to find himself at 44. Interesting number, a key figure in the Cold War's competition for prestige. He is and always had been, by inclination and intent, a pure, quote unquote, scientist. His real interest is in cosmic rays. He started being curious about cosmic rays back in the pre-war days when they were considered as widely abstruse and impractical as a study of the mating habits of seahorses or the inner structure of a grasshopper's brain. But today he can tip back his head and look at the sky. Beyond its outermost blue are the world-encompassing belts of fierce radiation that bear his name. No human name has ever been given to a more majestic feature of the planet Earth. Pause. Had to cough there. End quote. Readers were also reassured that Van Allen was, quote, about as American as a man can be, end quote. He came from Iowa and his mother was raised on an Iowa farm, doubtless making apple pie from an early age. As for his Dutch surname, everyone was reassured that those Dutchmen on his father's side, quote, came to the U.S. soon after the Revolution, end quote, and hence had been thoroughly imbued for 2.5 centuries with the necessary American credentials and patriotism. All of this publicity was carefully crafted as part of the Cold War PR battle between America and the Soviet Union. Yeah, for one thing, for sure. But it had a value as regards popular education in science because you could only with difficulty find anyone in America after the spring of 1959 who had not heard of that there were some kind of strange radiation belts surrounding the Earth, and that they were called Van Allen belts because the American hero Van Allen had discovered them from his basement, no less, and those irritating Russians had their noses out of joint as a result. No, it says his basement, so I don't know. We'll see about that. Perhaps they, quote unquote, may have had their Sputnik and Gagarin, but we, quote unquote, had Van Allen. Yeah, it's kind of strange. I don't know. At least all this publicity taught the public something about what surrounds the Earth beyond the breathable atmosphere. Perhaps if there had been no Cold War and Van Allen had not been publicized so widely, the people would have remained ignorant of the Van Allen belts for many decades to come. Sometimes public education in science comes in strange ways. Indeed it does. In 1956, while Van Allen was still a lowly and unknown scientist ostensibly working quietly at the University of Iowa, he published a book entitled Scientific Uses of Earth Satellites. In fact, Van Allen was probably already working for the Electronics Program Office of the U.S. Office of Naval Research. There you go. Albeit usually physically present in Iowa, the Office of Naval Research is essentially one of many American intelligence agencies. There you go. One that specializes in scientific research, and we will later come across it as the employer of Freeman Cope. The Army and the Air Force have their own equivalents, but the naval one tends to have the highest reputation for high-quality scientific work. All three of them could either operate independently or operate as covers, quote unquote, for the CIA. Sad trombone. It is very common for talented scientists spread across the universities of America to have their salaries paid ultimately by government intelligence agencies, sometimes not even the intelligence agencies whom they think are paying them, but instead by one hiding behind another. And the universities like this because they get paid high-profile professors. They get high-profile professors for free. Yeah, they like that, don't they? The downside is that the government owns, quote unquote, those men and women. I should have highlighted that when I had a working highlighter. They own these people. So what does that tell you? Who have to sign onerous contracts that give the agencies power to withhold publication of much of their most important work. and even to slap secrecy restrictions on what these scientists can say about it to friends and colleagues. That's just what I like about Temple because he doesn't beat around the bush as far as like being frank about what's going on to some degree uh, concerning government and scientific endeavors. I mean, he's not the only one, but I'm just glad, he mentions these kinds of things because you can have plenty of scientific writings and books and what articles and whatnot, and not really uh, get like a better picture. People are too specialized and compartmentalized that they just focus on one little thing in their field, and that's that. Whereas Temple gives a little bit of a larger picture, a larger context. Anyways, in this, since 1947, the U.S. government has had the power to declare any scientific work taking place in America secret, quote unquote, and restrict its publication on grounds of national security. And these restrictions do not have to be explained or justified. Exactly. Everyone in the security world knows that there is a great deal of unnecessary overclassifying, quote unquote, going on, with material declared secret without any rational justification. But also on the other end, you have stuff that would very much uh, have just rational justification. So it is what it is. But there is very little oversight for this process. In other words, a very substantial proportion of America's ostensibly disparate scientific community really works secretly for the government, or as conspiracy theorists would like to say, for the CIA, quote unquote, using the CIA, quote unquote, to stand for the plethora of intelligence agencies, including the Office of Naval Research, now apparently absorbed into DARPA. There you go. Or Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where you can have all the unacknowledged special access programs that you can shake a stick at. Which are lumped together for the sake of ordinary conversation as the CIA, quote unquote. I mean, that's very oversimplifying it, of course. It is publicly admitted that there are at least 17 different intelligence agencies in America. Well, now it's like what, over 50 or something? I forget. I don't. I haven't really looked into how many there are. Too many, in my opinion. Many are genuinely separate agencies which exchange information with each other from time to time and are theoretically coordinated today by a central body, the competence or incompetence of which is, of course, secret, even from the politicians, especially from the politicians. Bunch of clown actor liars, but pathological liars, narcissistic fucking retards. So who knows whether it all works seamlessly or not, and who will ever know? Well, hopefully we will someday. Not holding my breath though. In the Appendix 3 bibliography for Van Allen, uh, it may be seen that under the dates of 1979 and 1982 are listed articles by Van Allen that are stamped released for publication, quote unquote, by the U.S. Department of Defense. In other words, just about everything Van Allen wrote could only be made public with the specific written permission of the government. So we will never know how many of his studies remain secret, and there are bound to be many of them. In evaluating the work of Van Allen, we must always keep this in mind, that we know only part of the story and will never know the whole of it. Some aspects of Van Allen's work are barely documented in archives open to the public at all. For instance, the fact that he was intensely active in trying to find out how to make better semiconductors is only revealed by the fact that his contribution to a 1961 conference on the purification of semiconductor materials was included in the proceedings of the conference published by Macmillan as a scientific text in 1962. The reason why ultra purification, quote unquote, is so important for semiconductors is that the purer the chips are, at that stage they would have been made of either silicon or germanium, the better the electrons flow in them, and the more efficient they are. I have been in a chip factory and seen that the fanatical obsessions with purity and cleanliness are a commercial necessity. Everything takes place in clean rooms, quote unquote, into which one cannot enter, though you can see into them through windows from a corridor. The slightest speck of dust is enough to frighten everyone in the building. But people do not tend to know that Van Allen was involved in all of this. Instead, Van Allen will forever only be associated with scientific space exploration. Since 1953, 7 years before the article in Time, rocket launches had been detecting some anomalous radiation phenomena in the high atmosphere, but it was only in 1958 that satellites were launched, which instead of shooting up into the atmosphere and then quickly falling down again, as rockets did, could continuously monitor the high regions for radiation. The very first such satellite, which was later publicly known as Explorer 1, had initially been called simply Satellite 1958A, or Alpha, identified by the year of launch and the Greek letter alpha. Well, there you go. Which, being in the first letter in the Greek alphabet, signified that it was the first satellite launched that year. This satellite detected unmistakable signs that there was a belt of radiation surrounding the Earth. The second satellite, later known as Explorer 2, did not search for such information. The third satellite, 1958 Gamma, tagged with the Greek letter Gamma, which is the third Greek letter, came to be known as Explorer 3, and it confirmed what Explorer 1 had found. In his book of 1956 and in a 5-page article in 1957, Van Allen had published accounts of what the earlier rockets had detected, which he still referred to as auroral radiation, quote unquote. By that, he meant that he thought he had detected the source of the radiation that streams down and forms the aurora borealis, and perhaps also the polar ring current made mostly of protons and positively charged ions that circulates in the Earth's magnetosphere far above the atmosphere. After the Explorer satellite findings, still referring to them as satellites 1958 Alpha and Gamma, Van Allen and his colleagues on his team, George Ludwig, Ernie Ray, and Carl McElwain, published in a series of 3 articles in 1958 reporting on the amazing discoveries of a radiation belt around the Earth. Excuse me. These findings entirely superseded the accounts published only the year before from Rocket Findings. After that, Van Allen switched to the Journal of Geophysical Research as the medium for announcing his further findings, and published numerous articles in that periodical of the American Geophysical Union in Washington. And at the same time, he became a member of the board of editors of that journal and an associate editor. Due to his official ties with the journal, it was clear that he owed that publication the loyalty of allowing it to be the chosen vehicle for reporting his findings. The next thing that happened in 1958 was Project Argus. But to consult it on Wikipedia, you must type in instead Operation Argus, quote unquote, since Project Argus, quote unquote, is a name of today better known as one applied to a police operation. This involved sending 3 atomic BOMBs up into the high atmosphere and exploding them. As already mentioned, the first BOMB was of 10 megatons and was detonated on the 1st of August 1958. This bizarre project is worthy of extended discussion, which unfortunately in this book would be too great a digression. The BOMBs sent charged particles hurtling along magnetic field lines, and the results were monitored by the satellite Explorer 4. This helped scientists understand the radiation belt better. Whether it was good for the Earth and its inhabitants seems not to have been considered. Well, yeah, I mean, DARPA's not gonna care about that shit, would they? The motto of the people launching the Hell, am I reading this right? Launching the rockets, skip the line, and satellites seem to have been a heedless quote, when you gotta know, end quote, and the hell with what the consequences might be of blowing up all these atomic BOMBs above people's heads. The damage done to the atmosphere by this crazy and irresponsible project, one of the BOMBs was truly gigantic and incredibly dangerous, forms part of the sad history of mankind's progressive destruction of the ionosphere by military organizations, which I believe is the true cause of climate change, much more important than any carbon dioxide emissions. Well, I mean, it's a likely story, but my opinion, there might be something else that's at stake there. Whether I don't know how lasting that this damage is, or whether if it's still there, or if it has been healed, or quote unquote healed. But I guess we'll have to find out on that sometime, some other time. Van Allen's first article to appear in his newly affiliated journal was published in March of 1959 and was entitled Radiation Observations with Satellite 1958 Epsilon. I think that's Epsilon. I forget my Greek letters. Oh, it says it right there. The Greek letter epsilon, signifying that year's fifth satellite. It was written jointly with his colleague Carl Edwin McIlwain and George Ludwig. McIlwain was a young researcher who had made one of the key observations. Here are some of the remarks from that article that are of great historical importance and of deep interest. Quote, the earlier discovery of the great radiation belt around the Earth with satellites 1958 Alpha and 1958 Gamma has been confirmed and greatly extended with an apparatus of much greater dynamic range and discrimination. It appears likely that many important geophysical phenomena are intimately related to the reservoir of charged particles found to be trapped in the outer reaches of the Earth's magnetic field. The existence of a high-intensity corpuscular radiation composed of particles, in the vicinity of the Earth was discovered by apparatus carried by satellite 1958 Alpha, launched at 0348 3:00 3:48 in the morning, or is that in the afternoon? I forget if military time would be 0300. So this is 0348. So it's 3:48 in the morning on February 1st, 1958. The data from 1958 alpha and 1958 gamma showed that the intensity of radiation up to some 700 kilometers was in good accord with that to be expected for cosmic rays only. B, above some 1,000 kilometers, this transition altitude being longitude and latitude dependent, the intensity of radiation increased very rapidly with increasing altitude in a way totally inconsistent with cosmic rays. Rays coming from space, expectation, uh, inconsistent with cosmic ray expectations. It was proposed in our May 1st, 1958 report that the radiation was corpuscular in nature, was presumably trapped in lunes, arcs of three-dimensional space with thickness and shaped like crescents about the Earth, and was likely related to that responsible for aurorae. End quote. End quote. Or no quote. On the basis of these tentative beliefs, it was thought likely that the observed trapped radiation had originally come from the sun in the form of ionized gas, which may or may not have been subject to acceleration in the outer reaches of the Earth's magnetic field. The existence of such radiation had been presaged by our earlier rocket observations. We are not at this date prepared to report a range spectrum of the radiation, nor are we able to offer a definitive appraisal of the important matter of whether the more penetrating component consists of protons, of electrons, or of X-rays. On the basis of the evidence presented above, we regard it as established that the great radiation belt around the Earth consists of charged particles temporarily trapped in the Earth's magnetic field. The radiation belt may well be the seat of a distributed ring, quote unquote, current encircling the Earth, and the perturbations of the belt due to arrival of solar plasma may be directly responsible for solar storms. No detailed study of this possibility has yet been made. End quote. I wonder if they have made it by now. Probably. It's been like over 50 years. It's been like 70 years almost. I'm sure they figured something out by now. That was the end quote. What Van Allen had discovered was confirmation of the hypothesis put forward by Christian Birkeland. Furthermore, without apparently fully realizing the significance of what he was saying, Van Allen said that maybe there was a ring current, quote unquote, around the Earth. This article therefore can be considered as the first appearance in print of physical confirmation of Birkeland currents in space. But Van Allen and his colleagues were still struggling with the concept of plasma in space. They persisted in referring to what came from the sun as a gas, quote unquote, albeit an ionized gas, which they hesitantly called a solar plasma, quote unquote, but at this stage, no one yet understood the true nature of what we today refer to in common parlance as the solar wind, quote unquote, which the massive streaming of plasma from the sun outwards into the entire solar system and bathing the Earth. In December of 1958, the satellite Pioneer 3 discovered the second radiation belt high above the first and much larger. It was during the same year of 1958 that Eugene Newman Parker proposed the existence of what we now call the solar wind, quote unquote. During 1958, Van Allen approached the scientist Tommy Gold for advice on how to understand and interpret the satellite findings. In his article just quoted, Van Allen says, quote, "We are grateful for Professor T. Gold for an opportunity to discuss a number of matters of general physical interpretation, end quote. As I mentioned earlier, Tommy Gold, 1920 to 2004, and I were good friends towards the end of his life. It was 1959 it was 1959 that Tommy coined the term magnetosphere, quote unquote, to describe the plasma regions above the Earth, including the newly discovered Van Allen belts. I believe it was Tommy who had edged Van Allen and his colleagues away from the idea that what was coming from the sun was simply ionized gas and tried to get them to think of it as plasma, which, as we know now, is correct. He could see that the plasma consisted not primarily of atoms of gas, but instead of charged particles. Tommy thus did a lot to advance our understanding at this stage. In 2013, a temporary third Van Allen belt was discovered by NASA, but it was subsequently destroyed by a shock wave from the sun. Ruh-roh, or so the story goes. Dun dun dun. Though it may simply be a cover story to explain its destruction by human interference. The second and outer Van Allen belt is not known to consist largely of electrons, whereas the inner and smaller one consists of a mixture of protons and electrons. It was only in 2014 that it was discovered that the inner edge of the outer Van Allen belt is very sharp and highly defined, and resembles a protective barrier. A protective barrier. Scientists are still trying to understand that discovery. Yeah, I bet they are. This finding is, however, precisely what one would expect, because plasma regions, whether large or small, are routinely surrounded by closely fitted plasma sheaths, which are rather thin, and their edges do tend to be very sharp and highly defined. As we know, as we now know, is the outer Van Allen belt. In other words, what continues to be discovered about the Van Allen belts provides increasing evidence that they are standard plasma belts of the classic type. Our planet is thus the solid core of a vast plasma entity that surrounds it. Hmm. Indeed, we accept that the Van Allen belts and the atmosphere of the Earth are just as are. Man, I'm getting discombobulated here. Let me start over. We need to accept that the Van Allen belts and the atmosphere are the Earth just as much as the solid core. Yeah, I can definitely go with that. Our planet is more than solely a round ball in space. If we remember the fairy tale of the Princess and the Pea, we might compare the planet on whose surface we live to the pea under the mattress. All we have to do is bend the mattress into space, into a sphere, suspend the pea in the middle, and presto, we have the whole Earth. The fact that the mattress is invisible to our retinas, and we can see only the pea, is neither here nor there. Protective barrier. It's a vast plasma entity. Now, Chapter 11, Radiant Matter, Plasma and Plasmoids. For the last few chapters, we have been considering the existence and flows of plasma in space and how these come to be recognized and understood. Now we turn from the cosmically large scale to the absolutely minuscule, and to the story of how plasma came to be discovered and explored within the laboratory. Winston Harper Bostick, one of the great heroes of this history, he followed in the footsteps of Langmuir and Spitzer. He was a contemporary of Alfvén, and their work intertwined. Bostic's great individual contribution was his discovery of plasmoids. Plasma is all around us, as we have seen, making up over 99% of the universe. A plasma is a distinct entity that it has emerged from the great plasma soup, and a plasma. Yeah, headset conked out again. It's like clockwork. It's ridiculous. Well, I'll start over again. Plasma is all around us, as we have seen, making up over 99% of the universe. A plasma is a distinct entity that has emerged from the great plasma soup, and a plasmoid is a type of plasma which, as we are about to see, is often spherical or blob shaped, or sometimes shaped like a donut toroid, and it also has strange properties. It is worthwhile recounting what happened in some detail because it was what was discovered and the manner in which it was discovered revealed so much of importance. In the mid 1950s, the 39-year-old Bostic was working as a scientist in the brand new radiation laboratory of the University of California at Livermore. It is today called the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. The lab had been created in 1952 by Robert Oppenheimer's best friend E.O. Ernest Orlando Lawrence (1901 to 1958), who had won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1939, and Edward Teller (1908 to 2003), who is often called, quote, "the father of the hydrogen bomb," end quote. It was created to supplement the U.S. government's nuclear warfare research at Los Alamos. The Livermore Lab continues to be entirely controlled by the U.S. defense establishment and proudly announces on its website today that for more than half a century it quote, has applied cutting edge science and technology to enhance national security, end quote. Bostic was asked to investigate the firing of plasma into magnetic fields in order to see how the magnetic fields might become deformed, and to study the interactions between plasma and magnetism. In particular, he was to look for, quote, "the manner in which magnetic field lines can be dragged and twisted," end quote, as as he said in an article in 1938. This had many defense implications, especially relating to the hydrogen bomb, as well as being relevant to the potential control of nuclear fusion for purposes of producing energy, as nuclear fusion can theoretically be confined by magnetic fields. So we're getting warmer. Any solid material, such as steel, used in an attempt to confine superhot plasma would simply melt. And that's why they needed cold fusion, right? And they put the kibosh on that real quick. Bostic had assumed that he would be firing bursts of plasma at a magnetic field and that they would essentially be blobs of plasma, quote unquote, and that it was the magnetic fields and not the blobs that would be of interest. He was not at all prepared for what actually happened. If he had discovered something of lesser importance, it would probably have been swallowed up in the gigantic secrecy machine that eats most scientific research done for defense purposes in America. However, what Bostic found was not of such earth. I got that backwards. What Bostic found was of such earth-shaking importance that he had to be cleared to publish accounts of part of what he had discovered, because it was so game-changing in physics that worldwide debate was clearly going to be necessary to try to figure out what it all meant. Funded by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, Bostic had invented what is called a plasma GUN, quote unquote, which he refers to more conservatively as a button source, quote unquote, uh, because the tip of a GUN, quote unquote, was like a button. And he begun using it to fire plasma into a magnetic field in his lab. And this was when the surprise discovery was made. 11 months later, Bostic's lengthy report, accompanied by many photographs, was published in Physical Review under the title Experimental Study of Ionized Matter Projected Across a Magnetic Field. Man, they make these titles so boring. In this article, he announced, quote, "The plasma is emitted not as an amorphous blob, but in the form of a torus, the geometrical term for a donut shape. We shall take the liberty of calling this toroidal structure a plasmoid, a word which means plasma magnetic entity." End quote. In a footnote of this point, at this point, Bostic was careful to give the credit to the Princeton physicist David Pines for coming up with the term plasmoid, quote unquote. Bostic had originally thought of using the term plasmon, quote unquote. Yeah, that sounds kind of goofy. Also, as if plasmoid doesn't. Also a term coined earlier by Pines, but Pines pointed out to Bostic that plasmon, quote unquote, would really be inappropriate for technical reasons. And so Bostic happily adopted Pines's suggestion of the word plasmoid instead, quote unquote. I contacted David Pines and asked him the details of the naming of plasmoids, and this is what he said in an email to me in December of 2015. Quote, "You are correct. I did suggest the name to Winston, as plasmon, a term I had earlier coined, was in the process of becoming widely used to describe a quantized plasma oscillation, just as phonon describes a quantized sound wave. And now we have plasmonics and nanoplasmonics as a major subfield of nanoelectronics." End quote. In case anyone is wondering what a quote a quantized wave end quote means, it refers to part of a wave forming something resembling a particle. In other words, the ripple, technically called an oscillation, quote unquote, becomes a thing. The best description of this, together with the analysis of the equations applying to it, and the formation of what he called singular regions, quote unquote, by a wave, was done by Louis de Broglie, something like that, in the 1950s, and I have given a lengthy exposition of this in my technical paper, "Is Particle Mass a Function of Degrees of Freedom?" End quote, quote unquote, in 2016, a paper that may be downloaded from my entry on researchgate.net. So it was that the word plasmoid was coined, which was to be one of the key words of the physics of plasma to come. This 1956 paper by Bostic is thus of immense historical significance, and I am happy to add further clarity here about David Pines's crucial contribution for the historical record. In Figure 20, I reproduce the first published drawing of a plasmoid, which appeared in Bostic's article in 1956. This three-stage drawing shows the plasma emerging from the plasma GON at length at left in the form of a ring, and then breaking free and becoming a closed ring or torus. By this point, the plasmoid is about 5 centimeters in diameter. Man, I cannot pronounce things tonight. Numerous photos were also published with the paper showing many other strange and unexpected phenomena. Here we go. It starts coming out. It's a whoop, whoop. Figure 2 mechanism of projection of a plasmoid. No externally excited magnetic field is employed. Figure 20, how to make an electric donut. The plasma GUN, quote unquote, is at left, and from it emerges in 3 stages shown in T1, T2, and T3, meaning time 1, time 2, and time 3, quote unquote, a plasmoid in the shape of a donut, known in geometry as a torus. This is Bostic's own diagram from his famous 1956 paper and depicts the first plasmoid ever created artificially in a laboratory. Bostic's discoveries were truly revolutionary. As he says in the paper, quote, in spite of the fact that there has recently been considerable theoretical interest in the interactions of plasmas and magnetic fields, there had been no theoretical predictions concerning the existence of plasmoids, end quote. In other words, no one had ever imagined that such things as plasmoids existed or could exist. The discovery that bursts of plasma were not merely shapeless blobs, but were tori, the plural of torus, i.e. donut shapes, was bizarre enough. But this got much stranger than that. In his article and others that followed, Bostic described these features. In this first plasmoid paper, he discussed the interactions of plasmoids with each other. Quote, rather interesting and unexpected effects are produced and when two plasmoids are projected at one another across the magnetic field. For example, the photograph shows an interaction that looks at first sight like an elastic collision of two billiard balls. When striking effects can be attained when two plasmoids are fired at each other when the pressure in the vacuum chamber is raised. These effects become even more spectacular when 4 sources instead of 2 are employed. End quote. When 4 plasmoids were fired at each other, they spun into dramatic spiral shapes, of which Bostic published photographs. They seemed to him to be behaving as living entities. Quote, in other words, he wrote, we appear to be dealing with bodies which have strong powers of self-organization and preservation. End quote. He also described the plasmoids as being made of a, quote, self-organizing putty, end quote. Bostic became so excited by this that he also reverted to an earlier concern with galaxy formation and wrote, quote, it is possible to apply the knowledge gained concerning the nature of plasmoids to a hypothesized process of galaxy formation, end quote. What Bostic is getting at here is that the behavior of charged plasma and plasmoids may be similar at all scales of size, from these tiny plasmoids in his laboratory to the scale of entire galaxies in space. I mean, fractals, right? This is the one with 2 plasmoids, I think. Figure 21. Bostic's photo taken as a 2-microsecond snapshot, quote unquote, showing what happens when he fired 2, not 4, plasmoids at each other. To his astonishment, they combined to form a barred spiral, quote unquote, shaped barred spiral barred spiral shape resembling the well-known barrel spiral galaxies in space. As he wrote, quote, occasionally two plasmoids crashing head-on break into fragments, but even these fragments seem to behave as entities. In other words, we appear to be dealing with bodies which have strong powers of self-organization and preservation, end quote. Here we go, four of them. You know, this kind of looks like a certain symbol, but I'm not going to say what. It's similar, but not exact, of course. Figure 22, Bostic's time exposure photo of what happens when he fired four plasmoids at each other by aiming all of them at a common central point. He did this in a thin gas within a magnetic field, which is at right angles to this to this page rather. As soon as the plasmoids were fired, they ionized the gas so that electric current started flowing. The effect was this astonishing phenomenon of a twisting and whirling ring with spiral arms. As he says, quote, the formation looks strikingly like a photograph of a spiral galaxy. We can look upon the combination of plasma and magnetic field as a kind of self-shaping putty. Perhaps study of the forms assumed by this putty may help us understand configurations such as the stars and galaxies. It may also throw light at the other end of the scale on the construction of fundamental particles such as the electron, the proton, mesons, and neutrinos. They, too, may be made of self-organizing putty, a putty composed of the electromagnetic field and its own gravitational forces, which, working together, create bodies we know as particles. End quote. He then gave cosmological details about that, which we need not go into, except to point out that he was clearly developing the idea that the tiny plasmoids in his lab were, in his opinion, models of what took place in interstellar space, with plasmoids essentially spanning reaches of space that would eventually contain many millions of stars. I mean, it's kind of like fractals, right? However, this was mostly bad news for Bostix's bosses. They wanted BOMBs and power plants, not galaxies. Come on now. You can't have that boring stuff. We need weapons. Bostic was perhaps beginning to look too much like an idealist to make the generals comfortable. They had been hoping for something quite different, an easy way to handle plasma in a magnetic environment. They did not want plasma to start misbehaving and running amok in Bostic's lab like that and forming things that were bouncing off each other and appearing to be solid. But of course, they had to find out more, so Bostic continued his investigations, and worse, quote unquote, was to come. The the pace of work and of publication now sped up. By 1st of January 1957, a further article appeared in Physical Review. This time, Bostic was joined by two other authors, E.G. Harris and R.B. Theus, both military scientists brought in from the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. It seems that Bostic was to work from now on with men who had military requirements and interests foremost in their minds and would perhaps keep an eye on him. Harris was a specialist in hot plasma physics. Theus was born in 1921 in Tennessee, joined the Army in 1943 as a private, and by 1956 was a nuclear scientist specializing in radiation and particle beams, who would later study the effects of radiation exposure on organisms. The new paper was called Experimental investigations of the motion of plasma projected from a button source across magnetic fields, quote unquote. It reported new studies showing that the speeds of plasmoids could be increased by aligning the magnetic field in a particular way. However, there were even more unusual findings. Quote, the great variety of curious and unexpected phenomena observed seem to indicate that the plasma does not move as an amorphous blob, quote unquote, but must possess some sort of structure that is stable for the length and of time involved. We shall refer to this structure as a plasmoid. The purpose of the series of experiments reported here is to gain some insight into the structure of these plasmoids, the way in which they are formed, and the mechanism by which they move across magnetic fields. End quote. One of the new experiments was to shoot a plasmoid at a 0.65 centimeter wide hole in a copper plate to see if it would go through, which it did. This was done several times and occurred in both the presence and the absence of a magnetic field. But when a magnetic field was applied, after going through the hole, the plasma stretched out at right angles to its course. They then placed a wire screen with a 2 millimeter mesh in front, and the plasmoid went through that even though it was far larger than 2 millimeters. So then they thought, as plasmoids bounce off one another, perhaps we can bounce one off a copper plate with no hole. What happened next was really disturbing. The plasmoid passed through the copper plate as if it were not there, a phenomenon we have already noted in relation to lightning balls and fermions, quote unquote, on the quantum scale, and which is also similar to the behavior of angels and other spiritual beings as reported in religious traditions. Furthermore, the plasmoid did not merely go through the metal sheet head on, it even went through the entire length of the sheet when the sheet was placed flat in its path and in a failed attempt to bisect the plasmoid. Now the military people really had something to spook them. They could produce plasmoids that could pass through considerable thickness of metal. What could this possibly mean for potential future weapons? For the vulnerabilities of the walls of tanks? For the sides of aircraft? For the White House itself, which did not even have copper walls? Little interest is taken these days in Bostic's work, because only a minority of scientists show an active interest in recording the history of discoveries in their fields. The ones who do take the trouble often do a wonderful job, however, if only there were more of them. But as far as Bostic's work is concerned, I have not come across any attempt to chart his efforts since the American Physical Society issued a reprint of some of his key articles in 1963 in the form of a pamphlet. I have managed I have managed to collect original copies of everything that was made public by Bostic at that time. I have found over many decades of studying the frontiers of science that one learns the most about a new subject by very clearly scrutinizing the earliest publications, where unguarded remarks are often made and speculative hints are dropped by the enthusiastic discoverers and their colleagues. This is especially the case with the work done for military authorities. But the censors and secrecy guardians at first tend not to understand the full significance of new discoveries, so they do not always know which aspects of the new things they should be censoring. It takes them a year or two to figure it out. So often the only time one get let me reread that. So often, the only time one can get some deeper insight into the new discoveries is from the initial reports. But they are an initial, so, discovering these new findings doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna understand everything all at once, so it's like a hit or miss kinda thing, I would think. You can hit pay dirt or you can hit nothing. It just depends on how tuned in, for lack of a better word, that these, researchers are to what they're researching. Then the steel curtain is drawn down upon the subject, and no one dares talk or publish at all without written approval and very strict controls. I have known many fascinating scientific subjects to vanish entirely from public view because of paranoid censorship. Military and security quote unquote people tend to have no concern at all for the public's understanding of science. They are only interested in weapons and what they call public safety, quote unquote. They make decisions, often holding science back by decades by suppressing knowledge of crucial developments. Yeah, I bet they do. Big time. Although the next article by Bostic to appear in print was his article Plasmoids, quote unquote, in the Scientific American for October of 1957. After the next development in terms of the chronology of discovery was a paper of his, which, although not published until 1958, had been delivered to an international conference in August of 1956 in Stockholm. This was a live talk, the text of which was then published with many photographs plus the text of the conference discussion that followed the delivery of the paper in the proceedings of that conference. Since it often takes a year or two to get such mammoth volumes containing contributions from scientists all over the world edited and printed, that was why it did not appear until 1958. This is the one paper that by Bostic, usually mentioned in footnotes by contemporary scientists who have not bothered to look up his other publications. The Stockholm Conference was organized by and chaired by that giant figure in plasma science, Hannes Alfvén, whom we already know from chapter 8. Even though it was really a 1956 paper, I shall call it Bostic's 1958 paper after its year of publication because that is what everybody calls it. When he delivered it, Bostic was still at the Livermore lab, but by the time of publication in 1958, he had moved to a new institution. A footnote was added describing him as, quote, now at Stevens Institute of Technology, Hoboken, New Jersey, United States of America. End quote. The Stevens Institute is hardly a household name, but it is an extremely important center of scientific and technological research on the East Coast of America, not far from New York City. Bostic became professor of physics and head of the physics department. Perhaps he was glad to get away from people preoccupied with military matters and be free to do some normal science without being asked all the time what kind of weapon it would be good for. And who knows, perhaps he was glad to escape certain colleagues as well. He did remain a consultant to Livermore and in 1973 spent a summer there on a special project with Ovid Zucker. But his best colleagues appeared to have been the ones at Stevens, his closest being Vito Nardi, with whom he worked for decades. Nardi's name will come up again later. In his 1958 paper, Bostic extended his insights into plasmoids by saying something truly remarkable. Quote, it is entirely possible that ions and electrons ejected from the sun come to Earth in the form of a plasmoid, end quote. This is an astonishing suggestion, which was later adopted by Hannes Alfvén, who also believed that huge plasmoids came in the solar wind all the way to the Earth from the Sun. Indeed, in his book Cosmic Plasma, 1981, Alfvén even spoke of plasmoids being fired from the Sun as if from a plasma GUN, thus carrying the analogy of with Bostic's work even further. What is important for our argument here is that giant plasmoids from the Sun, given the complex behavior that led Bostic to think. Headset conked out again. Sheesh. Where was I? Complex behavior that led Bostic to think of them as living entities could easily be so intricate and complex in their structure that, in line with the discovery of the Kordylewski clouds, they could even be intelligent or conscious entities. The implications of that would be truly limitless. Just imagine, for instance, that every plasmoid belched forth by the Sun and reaching the Earth or one of the Kordylewski clouds could be, in effect, a program, in the sense of a computer program, and in that sense, a communication of intelligence. Oh, I don't even know where to start with that. I think some people might have an idea. In that scenario, the Sun could be controlling the Earth's atmospheric phenomena directly when it wishes. Such plasmoids could also, in principle, contain information that receptive people could perceive indirectly as inspiration. Quote unquote. Well, there you go. The Sun could talk to, quote unquote, the Kordylewski clouds, the planets, our higher atmosphere, and anyone else who is listening. SETI people should really look for coded information concealed in plasma bursts coming from the Sun. But before we can explain that, we need to know some more about the fundamentals of plasmoids and their habit of emitting signals. Bostic reported that he had detected from his laboratory plasmoids, quote, signals which are believed to be associated with the magnetic fields trapped by the plasmoid, end quote. He says, quote, the structure of these signals is too complex for analysis, end quote. If that is the case for tiny plasmoids in a lab, how complex might we expect them to be in a gigantic solar plasmoid striking the Earth's magnetosphere and interacting with it? Bostic elaborates further on the solar plasmoids. Quote, it is quite possible that ionized material ejected from the surface of the Sun proceeds and escapes across the magnetic field of the Sun in the same manner that laboratory-produced plasmoids cross a magnetic field, end quote. Excuse me. Bostic then goes on to talk about how he is playing with multiple plasmoids in his lab. Quote, several of these plasmoids can be made to spiral in consort to produce a ring of plasma. Not only is the torus produced automatically, but also it is stationary, end quote. Experiments showed that plasmoids could turn into standing waves. So like ball plasmas behaving like the quantum phenomena already alluded to, known as solitons. Thus, there are many books and papers describing solitons, but To go into them in any detail would take us too far afield. The important point to note here is that we have yet another example for the development of one of the weird phenomena observed in the quantum realm, occurring in the human quote unquote or macro realm. They can also exist within the human body, as subject discussed in numerous publications by Alexander Sergeyevich Davidov, probably butchering his name, 1912 to 1993, who was the director of the Institute of Theoretical Physics of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Two of his key books are Solitons and Molecular Systems, 1985, and Solitons and Bioenergetics, 1986. Bostic's descriptions of his plasmoids became increasingly eerie. Quote, one of the simplest results which must be understood in the barred spiral, quote unquote, which is produced by firing two sources at one time across a magnetic field, the two plasmoids seem to each other seek each other out unerringly. End quote. Not only do we now have hunting plasmoids, we even have mating ones. Quote, the leading edges of the plasmoids seem to seek each other out and latch on to one another. After the union of the two plasmoids has been accomplished, the angular momentum will wind them up into a spiral. The resultant plasma and magnetic configuration then seems to be stable. It is rather astonishing that such a bizarre configuration of plasma and magnetic field should appear to be stable. No theoretician known to the author has a priori dreamed of such a configuration, to say nothing of contemplating its stability. End quote. Bostic published photos and drawings of these weird shapes, which clearly delighted him. He was also able to produce plasmoids with forked tails and pairs of whirl rings composed of helical twists, which moved away from each other in space along magnetic field lines. He says that magnetic fields were trapped in these rings, but he was unable to explore, quote unquote, them further. Finally, Bostic enthusiastically reminded people of the possible cosmological implications of what he was discovering. Quote, by firing simultaneously two or more plasmoids across a magnetic field, it has been possible to produce cooperative phenomena which not only simulate the production of spiral galaxies and astronomical barred spirals, but which permit us to study these processes in the laboratory. End quote. In the discussion that followed, and which was printed in the proceedings, praise was heaped upon Bostic by various distinguished participants. Patrick Blackett, 1897 to 1974, a created who was created Lord Blackett in 1969 and won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1948 for his work on cosmic rays, said that Bostic's work had opened, quote, an extraordinary, exciting new field, end quote. Vincenzo Consolito Antonio Ferraro, must be Italian, I'm probably butchering his name, 1907 to 1974, a specialist in magnetofluid mechanics, said, quote, this is an interesting and important paper, end quote. And indeed it was. Meanwhile, the consternation of the military people might well be imagined. Bostic's plasmoids were behaving like mischievous imps. Everything they did was unpredictable. How could anyone ever control such wild things? I'm sure somebody has tried, or maybe succeeded. They were almost as bad as people. And the essential thing for all those who are obsessed exclusively with defense requirements is always control. Always, always, always control. Going public. The publication in late 1957 by Bostic of his article entitled Plasmoids, quote unquote, in Scientific American, the widely read magazine that acted as a bridge between scientists and the general population, brought these matters to the attention of the wider public for the first time. One may one might say that this was both the beginning and the end of public awareness of plasmoids, as the subject then vanished, and no meaningful or sustained public discourse about plasmoids ever really occurred afterwards. Oh, I think, when was this written? 2022? Some certain individuals have made it kind of popular again on YouTube slash Twitter or X or whatever. I don't really need to go into that because some of it's probably disinfo, to say the least, in order to control narrative. Anyways, there was a flurry of brief press articles in newspapers all over America reporting that a scientist named Winston Bostick had discovered strange things called plasmoids. But after Bostick ceased to be news, this stopped, and no one out there, quote unquote, seemed to get it, quote unquote. Plasmoids in the public sphere became merely a curiosity of the time, superficially reported, partially discussed in one major article by the man himself, and then frankly just forgotten. People's 5 minute attention span, quote unquote, now it's like 5 or 8 second attention span, of which we hear so much today, apparently already existed in the late 1950s. It is worthwhile seeing exactly what Bostic did and did not say in his one genuinely public quote-unquote article. Scientific American has always taken pride in having brilliant artists on their staff who do absolutely superb illustrations of almost any scientific subject. That's a tell in itself. Holy shit. For Bostic's article, the magazine artists took their rather basic illustrations and turned them into spectacular displays. This did much to bring the subject vividly alive. Bostic's Scientific American article commenced with this subtitle, quote, "These little pieces of plasma, a gas of electrons and ions, are created in the laboratory with an electric GUN. They have been unexpected. They have an unexpected capacity for maintaining their identity." End quote. On the very first page, there was a photo taken by Bostic of two glowing balls rushing away from each other and leaving luminous streaks behind, with a caption saying, quote, "Two plasmoids are fired at each other in a vacuum chamber. It can be seen that they repel and veer away from each other, so that each of the strange gaseous shapes retains its separate identity." End quote. So the public got the idea right away that Bostic was making weird little balls of gas, quote unquote, which turned into entities of some kind. But what was this gas, quote unquote? Bostic used his new word for it in his first paragraph, quote, "The gas is called a plasma," end quote. In this article, Bostic laid tribute to Irving Langmuir, who had begun serious plasma research. It was Langmuir who had coined the term plasma, quote unquote, back in 1928. Bostic wrote, quote, "The late Irving Langmuir of the General Electric Company began to study plasmas as long ago as 1921," end quote. Bostic was fascinated by the work of his predecessor, Langmuir, and took time to record Langmuir's ingenious experiments by which he was able to measure the temperature of the electrons in a neon light tube. Quote, Langmuir measured the electron's temperature and found that it amounted to about 20,000 degrees Fahrenheit, about twice as hot as the sun's surface. End quote. This temperature of 20,000 degrees Fahrenheit is 11,933 degrees centigrade. And yet that same neon light tube can be held in the hand and feels cool to the touch, even when the electrons in the center of the tube are twice as hot as the sun's surface. Very strange indeed. This information is a crucial fact which we need to keep in mind when we consider plasmoid entities. Anyone who thinks plasmoid entities cannot contain within very small space huge variations in temperature, pressure, and charge and complexity need only remember the lowly neon light tube. That is proof enough that the sort of complexity in plasma that we will be discussing as we go along is not only possible but probable. Later on, we will encounter such things as double layer sheaths and spiraling filaments inside plasma cylinders. And we will see how very hot and very cold plasma can exist happily side by side, protected by their surrounding sheaths, which isolate those regions from direct contact with another absolutely. In closely adjoining regions within cosmic dust clouds, such as the Kordylewski clouds, complex architecture within a plasmoid or plasma may be built up in this way with ease, contrary as that may be to our conventional thinking and experience. Bostic returned again to the subject of galaxy formation, quote, photographs of plasmoids in 3 dimensions show that as a plasmoid moves across the magnetic field, it is twisted into the shape of a left-handed screw. The, the tempting speculation is that the matter of our galaxies may have been formed under the influence of a vast galactic magnetic fields of one predominant orientation, which gave our matter a left-handed bias. End quote. He then ascribes another curiosity. In this instance, instead of mating, quote unquote, two plasmoids sometimes run away from each other. So, just as with humans, not everybody is attracted to everybody else, and there is such a thing as plasmoid rejection. Quote, under certain conditions, our plasmoids form a pair of rings, which do not stay in the center of the chamber but move away from each other in opposite directions. Our plasma rings are not whirls in a fluid, but are separate, independent bodies, quote unquote. As such, they represent a form of ordered organization by nature of which we may not been fully aware of until now. Here is a case of electrons and ions collaborating with a magnetic field to form bodies which, though inanimate, assume orderly, characteristic shapes and possess a firm integrity. End quote. This should remind us of the plastic microspheres in oil that were described in Chapter 3, which mimicked the behavior of swarming bacteria and appeared to be alive, quote unquote, when subjected to electric field pulses. The lessons to be drawn from Bostic's work have still not been fully realized. As early as the mid 1950s, it was per- perfectly obvious that separate independent bodies, end quote, with quote ordered organization, end quote, and firm integrity, quote unquote, have been created in a lab from plasma. And yet, no one dared to imagine what has become clear only in the last few years, namely that these plasmoids can become even more complex than our physical bodies. And our bodies are pretty complex, I would say. These can be more complex. How we doing here? Doop doop doop. One second, one second, one second. How far do we go? It's another 10 pages. I think we can probably do this. Chapter 12, Plasma Comes Alive. In this chapter, I'm going to bring together arguments to show that dusty plasma in space can and probably has evolved life and intelligence. The phenomenon of a burning candle illustrates the significance of dust. We have all seen burning candles, but how many of us realize that the flame of the candle is a small plasma? And why is the candle flame yellowish? That is because of the tiny particles of unburnt carbon dust soot embedded within the plasma, which arise out of the wax and tallow as the candle is burnt. When they reach a temperature of incandescence, they burn with a yellow color, and that colors the flame in the way that is familiar to us all, to all of us. The temperatures of the tiny carbon particles as they burn in a candle flame can exceed 1000 degrees centigrade, and yet you can pass your finger through the flame without harm. Very strange. This is another reminder of the highly complex natures of some plasmas, and that, as we mentioned at the end of the last chapter, extremely high temperatures can occur within them in pockets of or isolated sections or bounded cells, while the surrounding plasma remains cool. If we do not realize and emphasize the extraordinary complexities that make these bizarre internal disparities of plasmas possible, we cannot understand the evidence that will continue to be brought forward as to how there can be, as some scientists are now claiming, and also myself in what I have said about the Kordylewski clouds, living, intelligent plasmas. As plasma research progresses and becomes more and more urgent, while also becoming more and more bizarre, there are increasing numbers of experiments being carried out on what are called quote cryogenic plasmas, end quote. Plasmas at extremely low temperatures, such as we have we never encounter in normal life, which can only occur on Earth in scientific laboratories or in tubes of liquid nitrogen or other substances made in laboratories here and here. Scientists are creating plasmas and injecting them into substances at extreme low temperatures, such as liquid helium, to see what happens. Liquid helium is so cold that its temperature is approximately minus 269 degrees centigrade or minus 452.2 degrees Fahrenheit. At those low temperatures, a different temperature scale is used, known as the Kelvin scale, named after the Scottish scientist Lord Kelvin, 1824 to 1907. Using that scale, liquid helium has a temperature below 4.2 degrees Kelvin, also written 4.2 degrees K. The Kelvin scale is a purely scientific temperature scale, which sets zero at what is known as absolute zero, quote unquote, which is which we never encounter in daily life. Surprising differences occur in high temperature liquid helium plasmas, quote unquote, which are near to 4.2 degrees Kelvin, and low temperature, quote unquote, ones, which are much closer to absolute zero. Different phenomena appear at the different temperature ranges, and no one really understands all of that yet by any means. The reason I refer to these cryogenic plasmas at this point is because in 2005, a team of Japanese scientists funded by the US government's Asian Office of Aerospace Research and Development, AOARD, made an astonishing discovery. They found, quote, unexpected high temperature of charged carriers, quote, end quote, in the plasma, meaning that surprising temperature variations can occur within plasmas, even when these occur within host plasmas that are very near to absolute zero. This is far more extraordinary than being able to hold a neon light tube when it contains electrons that are twice as hot as the surface of the sun. This is like finding a patch of heaven that is deeply embedded in hell. Hmm. Let us recall that it was only in 1941 that Lyman Spitzer suggested that for the first time, that the huge clouds of interstellar dust that astronomers had observed for a long time through their telescopes might not be inert and useless stuff, but might be capable of becoming active and be charged to dust. He said that negative electrical charges could be transferred to the dust by electrons, in which he still called ionized gas, quote unquote, by which he meant what today we call plasma. Spitzer was making a tremendous conceptual breakthrough, and today electrically charged dust is a subject of such importance that it is talked about every day by scientists and technologists all over the world. That is not because they are all trying to figure out the universe. They are more practical. There are more practical reasons. The dust that occurs within plasma is of crucial importance to the electronic microchip manufacturing process, where too much dust in the plasma interferes with the deposition of circuits onto microchips. And also, as we have seen, in connection with attempts to control nuclear fusion for power generation. It is no exaggeration to say that trillions of dollars are at stake on matters concerning dust, how to understand it, how to deal with it, and even how to use it. The following year, 1942, Hannes Alfvén, some of whose breakthroughs we examined in Chapter 8, discovered the quote band structure end quote of the solar system and was able to demonstrate that that electromagnetic forces associated with a dusty plasma cloud from which the solar system was formed must have been dominant over the more usually mentioned gravitational forces in the formation of the solar system by contraction and solidification from, you guessed it, dust. And that dust would have been electrified dust. Electromagnetic forces are so much stronger than gravitational ones that they exceed the latter by a factor of 10, followed by 39 zeros. Holy cows. That is pretty crazy. By 1954, Alfvén had elaborated his ideas further and insisted that the planets and comets of our solar system, and by implication those of all other solar systems, were all formed as a result of the coagulation of dust particles in the solar nebula. The dust cloud, quote unquote, surrounding the early sun as a result of being electrically charged by plasma. The dust was more important for the solid planets, of course, since the giant planets largely consist of plasma that is not solid. Many plasma scientists now suggest that stars form initially from dust. What happens is that the charged dust in a large plasma cloud in space coagulates to form a dust ball, which constitutes what is called a protostellar core, around which more of the cloud slowly collapses until a star is formed. This would seem to be a variation on the biblical injunction to the effect that, quote, remember, O Son, that charged dust and plasma thou art, end quote. That's number 3 for the headset. My apologies. Wouldn't it be assuming if the center of our sun was really cold, compressed, was a cold, was really a cold compressed dust ball? As mentioned earlier, Chapter 3, in August of 1981, the satellite Voyager 2 took photos of the rings of the planet Saturn, and the rings were seen to contain mysterious radial shape-shifting spokes, quote unquote. The scientists J. Hill and D. Asoka Mendes in 1982 suggested that these spokes, quote unquote, consisted of charged dust, which was charged in a plasma. This was the first major invoking of charged dust to explain a solar system anomaly that had been discovered on another planet, and greatly raised the profile of dust within the scientific community. The suggestion was later amplified by Christoph Gertz, Goertz and Gregor Eugene Morfill in 1983, who suggested that the charging was caused by plasma bursts on Saturn. In 1986, Norman R. Berggren published a book suggesting another theory about the rings of Saturn, involving an extraordinary theory connected with ET. Some formation about that may be found in the footnote. It is very far from being a purely scientific theory. Yeah, no shit. We saw earlier that in 1986, Hiroyuki Ikase predicted that plasma crystals known as Coulomb crystals, quote unquote, could be formed by dust particles in a plasma. The existence of such crystals was announced at a conference in 1993 by Hubertus M. Thomas and Gregor Eugene Morfill, and in 1994 simultaneously published by 3 separate teams consisting of Thomas and Morfill, Jun-Ha Chu, and Lin Yi, and Yasuki Hayashi, and Kei Tachibana. At this point, dust reached a new high. Much of the dust in outer space actually takes the form of what are called dust grains. They are minuscule, but more solid than the kind of thing we are used to in the form of household dust. How much dust and dust grains is there in the universe in proportion to everything else? According to the physicist Douglas C.B. Whitted, author of Dust in the Galactic Environment, quote, submicron-sized solid particles, dust grains, account for roughly 1% of the mass of the ISM interstellar medium. Despite their relatively small contribution to the total mass, the remarkable efficiency with which such particles scatter, absorb, and radiate starlight ensures that they have a very significant impact on our view of the universe. For example, the attenuation weakening because of distance between us and the center of the galaxy is such that in the visual wave band, only one photon in every uh, 10 trillion reaches our telescopes. Yeah, trillion. The energy absorbed by the grains is re-emitted in the infrared, according to some 20% of the total bolometric. Bolometers measure luminosity, bolometric luminosity of the galaxy, end quote. Luminosity is a measure of the absolute brightness of something such as a star as opposed to its apparent brightness, which may be diminished by distance and our atmospheric interference. Since we now since we know that more than 99% of the universe consists of plasma, what little solid matter there is seems to exist primarily in the form of solid dust particles and grains, most or all of which floats in the vast plasma clouds. That reduces even further the amount of solid matter, quote unquote, of the sort that we see around us every day here on Earth, and it makes planets and moons even scarcer than we had thought in terms of proportion of what exists compared to everything else. That does not mean that there are few planets and moons. Quite the contrary. We now know that there are untold billions of them. But what it means is that no matter how many there are, they still form a negligible proportion to what exists. I do not believe anyone has calculated how much solid matter is left after you subtract the plasma bound dust. But as we face these facts, our familiar world is shrinking by insignificance all around us in the most drastic fashion. And as I have already pointed out, if we have a science that is merely based upon living in an atypical world, our science is going to be atypical. So we must reform it at once. Are some plasmas alive? We have been following the observation and testing of the influence of electromagnetic fields in the work of Langmuir, Alfvén, Kapitsa, Bostic, and others. Plasmas are bounded entities that persist through time, a characteristic of any living organisms that at the most basic level. Plasmas may feed on fresh plasma and be nourished, for example, by solar winds. They may even compete for such food. Plasmas even bond with one another and interact in other ways. Uh, there's a type no period, and interact in other ways. We have seen particles in plasmas swarming like microbial beings, chapter 3, and forming other patterns such as hexagonal structures, rubro, spirals, concentric circles, and double helix patterns. Hexagonals, hold up, hold the phone. Oh shoot, I typed a typo, hold on. Let's see for a second. Oh, why is this loading taking forever? Let's share. Hexagonal shapes, he was saying, right? Let me just double check. Hexagonal structures. So what we have here, share screen, is a hexagonal shape on Saturn. Well, 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 what do we have here? Very interesting. So I guess that would, at the very least, that means Saturn is at least partly plasma, if not all plasma. And he was talking earlier about Saturn's rings with the spokes and whatnot. So it's not that far of a stretch, I don't think. That at least Saturn, probably Jupiter, and what, Neptune maybe, are plasma, or maybe have a dusty complex plasma for the core of those planets, perhaps. But anyways, let's get back to the text. We do share screen. Hexagonal structures, spirals, concentric circles, and double helix patterns. Chapters 2, 3, 11. Nerve-like filaments grow in plasmas, including those that form double helixes and may carry information as well as energy. Plasmas seethe with movement in and around their own internal structures created by electromagnetic fields. Complex plasma entities have countless plasmoid regions within them, all protected within their sheaths and separated by voids, quote unquote, like organs in animal bodies. Some contain hot plasmas, some cold plasmas, some dusty plasmas, some non-dusty voids. You get a plasma, you get a plasma, everybody get plasma. Some containing impurities that may hinder or accentuate the flows of charged currents in the manner of electronic semiconductors and transistors. In other words, large plasma clouds are bound to have the equivalent of semiconductors scattered throughout themselves in order to modulate the current flows. So, but they're now large computers. Is that what you're trying to say, sir? That these plasmas are large computers? So that means the Kordylewski clouds are just two giant freaking computers that are bigger than 4.5 times each bigger than the Earth? This is speculation, of course, on my part. We have seen in the work of Peter Kapitsa, I don't know if I'm saying that name right, but that kind of sounds like it might be right, that the crystalline structure of complex dusty plasmas makes them potentially far more complex than human bodies. There are soft, broadly crystal-like structures that grow into beautiful and intricate entities with the ability to transmit information over vast distances. Particles within a plasma can interact in concert with other particles. Furthermore, and as we shall see shortly, the mysterious ability to move through objects without changing form, seen in quantum mechanics in the phenomenon associated with solitons, and sometimes called tunneling, quote unquote, takes place between organs, quote unquote, in a plasma. We will return to this later when we will explain tunneling, quote unquote. There is no universally agreed, mathematically precise set of defining qualities of a living entity. Most accounts include growth, cellular form, reproduction, response to stimuli, ability to receive and process energy. Of course, living beings that are not carbon-based, like ourselves, will not be alive in exactly the same way that we are, but will be alive, quote unquote, nonetheless. We met Vadim Nikolaevich Saidovich in chapter 3. We mentioned that this leading Russian researcher into plasma and collaborator and co-author with Nobel Prize winner V.L. Ginzburg in the 1970s wrote in 2007 that the principles used to define life are, quote, autonomy, evolution, autopoiesis, a system capable of reproducing and maintaining itself. He concludes, quote, complex organized plasma structures exhibit all the necessary properties to qualify them as candidates for inorganic living matter that may exist in space provided certain conditions allow them to evolve naturally, end quote. Are there intelligent plasmas? What are the defining qualities of an intelligent living entity? For a plasma to count as intelligent, and with an intelligence that involves features a bit like our own, for example, memory, the ability to perceive, communicate, model, choose, predict, and manipulate reality. For that, you may need a much greater level of complexity. You probably need a series of interdependent systems with both internal and external functions, plus an overarching system that coordinates the smaller systems. In Chapter 5, we saw that plasmas in the form of ball lightning appear to act intelligently, or at least to operate by an intelligence. We saw how they appear to navigate following aircraft and submarines. They know which way they are heading, turning at right or other angles, being still and then suddenly moving away at vast speeds, and even rolling down the aisle of an aircraft as if on an inspection visit. Kapitsa's discovery of the crystalline structures in some complex dusty plasmas discussed in Chapter 5, and the realization growing that from that, and based on the analogy with crystals in metals, suggested to me that it may be possible to calculate the destiny of electrons within a plasma. I realized immediately that did I say destiny? I meant to say density earlier, density of electrons within a plasma. I realized immediately that this density could be crucial when calculating the likelihood that intelligence might evolve in a plasma. This was much on my mind when I approached my friend, the mathematician and astronomer, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe. Wickramas, Wickramaswing. Keep adding the W in sing. It's not there. It's like a speech impediment or something. Wickramasinghe. That's about as good as I'm gonna get at it, I think. Who, like me, was a friend and huge admirer of Fred Hoyle's and had been mentioned by him. Fred supervised Chandra's PhD, and they co-authored numerous works. Chandra and I agreed to co-write an academic paper on the Kordylewski clouds, KDC, considering their potential to evolve intelligence. What follows is an edited extract with the maths removed. The full paper can be found as Appendix 1. Quote, the Kordylewski clouds at the point in space between the Earth and the Moon known as L5, the L stands for Lagrange, has a density over 100 times higher than the density of ambient interplanetary dust. The maths show that the mean distance between neighboring particles within the cloud is thus very short indeed. yielding the possibility of interparticle communication, quote unquote, if electromagnetic signals can be exchanged. This could be made possible because the dust would be charged to a potential of a few volts because of the photoelectric effect caused by absorption of solar ultraviolet photons, and collisions with ambient gas would lead to rotation spinning at radio frequencies. Spinning charged grains, particularly those in form of elongated needles typified by bacilli, would be efficient absorbers and emitters of electromagnetic radiation. This production of radiation because of spinning is explained more simply in a moment. Most interestingly, the total number n of such charged particles in a kdc distance of greater than 1 centimeter apart is truly vast. End quote. With electromagnetic wave emission slash absorption across cloud dimensions, as well as electrical connections, charge/current exchanges between adjacent charged particles only centimeters apart, a Kordylewski cloud might well be able to function as a gigantic computer/brain capable of storing and processing digital information. The maths also show the maths also shows that the cloud may have a super astronomical sum total for its potential computing power, exceeding the computing power available in all human brains, and indeed all other intelligent life on Earth as well, by very many orders of magnitude. Finally, we referred to a few of the remarkable features that are known to characterize dusty, complex plasmas and which could also play a role. The nucleation and growth of dust within such plasmas have been documented in several laboratory studies. In our case, however, the dust nucleation process would be sidestepped, and condensation within Kordylewski clouds is likely to occur upon pre-existing interplanetary potential biological dust particles. Thus, we could envisage a population of bacterial particles coated with semiconducting siliceous mantles that may well enhance interparticle electronic connectivity. Such speculations may sound far-fetched, but they lie within a broad framework of possible outcomes based on known behavior of complex dusty plasmas. We might thus be tempted to view dust balls as highly structured, intelligent, quote unquote, systems capable of storing and processing information, quote unquote, and realize that they may have many more surprising and unexpected features. Indeed, such huge stable entities that have presumably endured for astronomical timescales and have steadily grown in complexity over billions of years may display spontaneous evolved phenomena resembling those of the most highly complex living entities. This situation is not dissimilar to the brain-like activity, brain-like complexity of the cosmic web, quote unquote, discussed it by Ginsberg et al. 2019, although it is potentially even more impressive in its computational potential. The dust balls would contain an intricate combination of charged dusty plasma in gaseous, liquid, and crystal states, with regions of positive charge and regions of negative charge separated from each other by sheaths and double layers and containing superconducting filaments, so that it would be difficult for us to speak of a Kordylewski cloud as a whole being singly charged or having a total net charge or zero net charge, since so many there would be so many multiple regions of varying charges that a total net charge for each cloud would only be relevant when speaking of the cloud externally, such as in relation to the solar wind, which is known to be predominantly positively charged. Readers may still be wondering how such a seemingly tenuous structure as a Kordylewski cloud can possibly hang together, cohere, and become so incredibly complex. Space is full not only of dust, but also of elongated grains, not unlike rice in shape, or we may think of them as rods or cylinders. Hmm, you mean kind of like what people see as UFOs, like cylinder-shaped like cigarette-shaped cylinders? I don't know, it's a possibility. Which can be as large as 1 micron across. A micron is also called a micrometer. It is 1 millionth of a meter. The next smallest measure is a nanometer, which is 1,000th of a micron. In other words, 1 billionth of a meter. So don't think you can ever actually see a space grain, quote unquote, with your eyes, as a micron size one is the largest and most are even smaller. It is dust spheres and elongated dust grains of this size that constitute the bodies, quote unquote, of the Kordylewski clouds, and they are too much small to be detected by satellites that might ever pass near or through the clouds. But the clouds are so gigantic that there are trillions upon trillions of these constituents within them. They can be very diffuse by our standards, in other words, very far apart from the point of view of our own bodies, so diffuse as to seem almost not to exist at all. After all, at our human scale, we think of the atoms constituting our bodies as being very near to each other. Of course, the idea that our bodies are solid is an illusion. Sir Arthur Eddington asserted a century ago that all atoms consist of 99% empty space. Well, if the universe is 99%, does he say it? Nowadays, we might modify that to say, yeah, 99% an amorphous mist of tiny, tiny particles called quarks and gluons. Right. The point is that if you shrank to the size of a space grain, quote unquote, you would find that you could easily traverse an entire human body and see nothing substantial because everything of which it was constituted was too far apart to appear to consist of anything. In other words, we would all essentially be undetectable. So everything is a matter of scale, fractals. If you were the size of a Kordylewski cloud, you would very readily see them. You have to be big enough to see, quote unquote, them properly, or to have technology that can reveal them as ours has done, but with difficulty. Some of the dust grains are elongated rather than spherical, which generates the forces that are needed. This is because the space grains are each rapidly rotating, or as we can also say, are spinning. Circular vortex, spinning, 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 like this. This is no connection with the entirely separate subject of quantum spin, quote unquote. These rotations generate low frequency waves in the plasma, some of which have colorful names, quote the electron whistler and quote quote, the dust whistler, end quote, the dust cyclotron waves, uh, quote unquote, Alphin waves, and quote, electromagnetic ion cyclotron waves, end quote. Many of the dust grains are essentially levitated by electromagnetic forces. The space grains are set spinning by electrical fields, but they do more than rotate. They also quiver, quote unquote, and bounce, quote unquote, to use the very words actually used by the plasma scientists who published these findings in 2002. The idea of invisible spinning, bouncing, and quivering rice grains floating around in outer space and whistling, quote unquote, may seem like some science fiction fantasy or somebody's idea of a practical joke. But this is all true. This is all true. Trust me, bro. As the scientists say, quote, the dust grains execute bouncing motions. Furthermore, each grain also performs transverse quivering across the sheath electric field, end quote. The energy of the dust rotation can flow into the surrounding plasma and generate plasma waves. The grains are magnetic dipoles. That's number 4 for the headset. Sad trombone. The dust grains are magnetic dipoles, meaning that they have positive and negative poles. They are charged either negatively by thousands of electrons clinging to each of them, or positively by protons and ions clinging to them. And those charges are directly coupled to the electric field in which the dust grains reside. It is obvious, therefore, that these spinning grains are generating collectively a great deal of energy that pours into the surrounding plasma. As a result, microwaves are emitted, and it has been proved that Coulomb crystals, quote unquote, crystalline structures that can sustain themselves and remain differentiated from the plasma sea, can form, thus creating the elements of macro-sized structures, compartments, and pods, quote unquote, within the plasma cloud. So we see that it is the spinning grains that generate the energy to form structured clouds, as if they were a vast army of microscopic powered generators, which create, quote unquote, the organization of the whole cloud. The number of spinning grains inside each Kordylewski cloud could be as many as 10, followed by 26 zeros. We at this as we point out in see Appendix 1, the electrical connections and current exchanges between adjacent charged grains, even if our even if they are as much as a centimeter apart in a Kordylewski cloud, would create a structure that might well be able to function as a gigantic computer slash brain capable of storing and processing digital information. Ooh, baby. Having described the spinning microgenerators inside the clouds, I will now clarify a strange fact about dusty complex plasmas that makes all of this possible. I am going to quote a few words from the plasma scientists Dietmar Bloch and Andre Melzer in a paper they published in 2010. But I first need to explain that scientists have a term for describing elements of a system, such as particles, which have powerful interaction energies holding them together. They call this strong coupling, quote unquote. Think of a happily married couple who stick together for decades. Bloch and Melzer mentioned how strong coupling, quote unquote, works in normal, quote unquote, solid matter, which consists of atoms with very small interparticle distances. Then they say, quote, in dusty plasma, this situation is different. If micrometer-sized particles are immersed in a plasma environment, they immediately attain high negative charges due to the higher mobility of the electrons. Therefore, even at particle distances of the order of several hundred micrometers, the mutual interaction energy of two particles exceeds by far their thermal energy, and the system is strongly coupled. At the same time, this strongly coupled system has a fairly low particle density and a favorable ratio of the interparticle distance to particle radius. This combination results in a very high optical transparency, i.e., it is almost invisible, which allows us to observe individual particles even at the center of clouds containing more than 10 to the sixth mathematical way of writing 1 millionth particles. End quote. Just think what this means if translated into human terms. If we speak of human beings instead of particles, it means that if there were 1 million people standing together in a vast crowd covering a huge area of land, they would have to be so far from each other that even at a distance we could with a telescope distinguish and detect very separate individuals and detect every separate individual. This brings the common phrase you are a one in a million, quote unquote, into sharp focus. This is what a dusty complex plasma is like. Every single particle is one in a million, quote unquote, and can be individually detected in principle. And yet, this vast and seemingly tenuous grouping consists a powerful structure, unified, coherent, and immensely complex, bound together with overwhelming invisible strength and powerful forces. For us feeble humans who are not used to thinking of such things, we are like the public at the same time of Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, who simply could not imagine an Earth going around the sun, around going round a sun. This is how fantastically different thinking about dusty complex plasmas is from anything with which we are familiar in our lives. An analogy here on Earth would be if we were to claim that the ocean is a giant brain. Well, it is not. That is because it is here on Earth, is made of atoms, and is physical matter. This is how different plasma really is. With dusty complex plasmas, a tenuous and essentially invisible cloud in space can hold together and become a brain even bigger than an ocean. A brain so gigantic that it is many times larger than our entire planet. We have to get used to thinking like this and to realize that these clouds in space are so different from anything we know in our lives or anything we could have imagined, that all of our conventional notions are completely useless. Another crucial thing to realize about plasma structures is that they maintain their integrity by means of something called the double layer, also sometimes called a bilayer, which has helpful electromagnetic properties. Two different plasma regions of entirely different kinds of can be rigorously separated from one another by these double layers. The double layers are like the double skin being a sheet of positively a sheet of positive charge on one side and a sheet of negative charge on the other side. For those familiar with microbiology, they are similar to the double layers that occur within our own physical bodies as walls of cells called membranes, with a hydrophilic, water-loving surface facing one way and a hydrophobic, water-hating surface back to back with it and facing the other way. So hydrophilic, water-loving, and water hating over here. Oh wait, it's saying this thicker, like bead-looking layer is hydrophilic. Boop. The water's coming at it. It just tracks it here, but it gets repelled by this hydrophobic. So anything that passes through it would have to be something other than water, maybe? I don't know. Figure 23, a typical double layer cell membrane within a human body. Such membranes are analogous to the double layers that exist in plasma and which surround the plasmoids and all the current carrying filaments inside plasmas. Unless organic cells are protected by these walls called membranes, they cannot exist. The outward-facing parts of the membranes are hydrophilic, meaning water-loving, quote-unquote, heads, and hence friendly to the watery environments of the cell and body. The inward-facing parts are hydrophobic, meaning water-hating, quote-unquote, and they just hate being exposed to water. This excellent image comes from a course in anatomy and physiology, biology, Bio 264 cell membrane section at Brigham Young University, USA, and may be viewed at content.bui.ed. This is a simplified image of the basic structure of a cell membrane, although in reality there are often various plugins, quote unquote, sticking through and pathways for biocurrents, such as flows of protons and ions across the membrane. In this book, it has not been possible to take the space to discuss all these phenomena, for the discovery of which Peter Mitchell was the brilliant pioneer. By showing how currents flowed through membranes, he totally changed the previous view of metabolism as being a static chemical process known as the bag of enzymes, quote unquote, theory. He replaced that theory with the true description of what really happens, which is often called vectorial metabolism, meaning that metabolic processes are like vectors and have a direction in space. Pause. Which is far from the random processes of chemicals standing idly or sitting idly in a bag of enzymes, quote unquote, like loungers on adjoining deck chairs who might occasionally have a chat or a smoke. I gotta pause this. Had to go on bathroom break. Let's get back to this. We already looked at that picture. Oh, where was I? Peter Mitchell was a brilliant pioneer. Didn't get to this yet. Membranes, computer, biocurrent. We'll just start here. In this book, it has not been possible to take the space to discuss those phenomena, for the discovery of which Peter Mitchell was the brilliant pioneer. By showing how currents flowed through membranes, he totally changed the previous view of metabolism as being a static chemical process known as the bag of enzymes theory. Right, okay, yeah, I did read this. Bag of enzymes, I remember now. Like loungers adjoining deck chairs who might occasionally have a chat or a joke. Figure 24. An electric double layer at the top of the diagram. The rows of small circles enclosing minus signs represent electrons. So these up here are the electrons, and these are the protons. I'm assuming, which are negatively charged. The minus means negative, quote unquote, obviously. At the bottom of the diagram, the rows of the larger circles enclosing plus signs represent protons, which are positively charged. The plus sign means positive, quote unquote. Reading the card explains the card. As I drink my Gatorade, which I'll have to go to the bathroom again later, probably. Combined in this way, in a double layer, the electrons and the protons form a protective sheath which enables a blob of plasma to be protected from whatever is going on outside, and therefore to remain intact, quote, come hell or high water, end quote. Such a blob can cohere and retain its integrity in no matter what surrounds it, blasts it raise it blasts raise at it or tries to destroy it, up to a limit which is usually very high indeed. Without protective sheaths, such plasmoids and other plasma blobs, filaments, and entities would be rapidly destroyed and could have only uh, a momentary existence. It is clear that the same basic underlying principle is at work in the double layers of organic cells and the double layers of plasma blobs, or plasma cells, quote unquote, as we might well call them. In other words, the principle of the double layer surrounding wall seems to be a universal structure element found in both organic and inorganic natural phenomena as a means of enabling entities to maintain their identities within hostile or stressful environments, end quote. Image drawn for the author by Eric Wright. Take a sweet swig of this Gatorade. So to refine what we said earlier about the roles of sheaths, crystals, and voids in plasmas, It is partly because of these double layers that vastly differing regions can exist within a plasma body, particularly practically side by side. For instance, you can have an extremely hot interior of one plasmoid and an extremely cold interior of another plasmoid. As already discussed, they can be practically next to one another, but can coexist because of these double layers, which help isolate them entirely from one another. It is it is such double it is such double layers that surround the Birkeland currents in space, which were discussed earlier, and which transport electricity across interstellar and even intergalactic distances, which within those filamentary structures, the current spirals can be superconductive, which means that the current can pass without loss over vast distances, and there is no resistance to cause it to diminish at all. It is often said anecdotally that the human brain contains more neurons than there are observable stars in the night sky. But the human brain fits inside a small skull, a stable, dusty, complex plasma ball of immense size, which has possibly endured for aeons. Maybe hint, hint. Not like he would believe that. Um, Endured for aeons and experienced continual growth and expansion over countless millennia. It is in principle capable of developing something resembling a much more complex nervous system than a human brain, with its average lifetime of around 100 years. A complex, dusty Kordylewski cloud could that has existed for many millions of years might even have become self-aware with all that this implies. It is conceivable that Fred Hoyle's fictional The Black Cloud has a reality in the context of the Kordylewski clouds, which of course he could not have recognized in 1957. I would recommend Hoyle's science fiction novel to everybody, as it is a thrilling and scientifically based tale of cosmic menace and the race against time to save our species. In the book, a dark patch is noticed in space by astronomers looking through a telescope. It wasn't there before. How did it appear? What is it? Over time, over a period of time, the dark patch gets bigger and bigger. The conclusion is inescapable. It is headed our way. It gets more and more threatening as it gets closer. Eventually, the astronomers notice that it is a gigantic cloud that emits no light. Hence, it is a black. Hence, is a black cloud, quote unquote. No one knows what it could possibly be. It must be stressed that this extraordinary anticipation of the existence of the gigantic, dark, invisible clouds in space resembling the Kordylewski clouds was published at a time when space was regarded as a vacuum, 4 years before Kordylewski reported his extraordinary discovery. As the cloud gets closer and closer, the fate of the Earth and all its inhabitants is threatened, since the sun's light will be blotted out. Well, 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 where have we heard that before? It is discovered that the black cloud is a huge, intelligent entity with a gigantic brain. We might even think of it as a non-glowing plasmoid. Intelligent contact is established with the cloud, and Hoyle satirizes the political as well as scientific hysteria on Earth. The public are kept uninformed as long as possible, of course, since that is always official policy. And just when the Earth is about to be destroyed and everybody is prepared to die, something unexpected happens. The black cloud, with its super sensitivity to distant signals in space, picks up a signal from very far away indeed in another part of the galaxy. It is another black cloud. So the black cloud, which is about to engulf the Earth, not intentionally, but because it is big and clunky, suddenly changes course and rushes off to find a new friend, and the Earth is saved. Yay! We're saved. Fred's novel brings up the obvious subject of communication with the Kordylewski clouds. If the clouds are as intelligent as I am suggesting, then they already know all about us while we almost know nothing about them. In conclusion, from Chandra's and my paper, we can see that the particles in dusty plasmas, such as the Kordylewski clouds, can be close enough to exchange electrical signals. In chapter 14, we will look at other great scientists who have developed ideas that can help us understand more clearly, excuse me, how intelligent in complex dusty plasmas might work, including Paul Dirac and David Bohm, 1917 to 1992. David Bohm. Do I have something right now? Or am I thinking of David, another David? David Bohm. No, I don't have anything wrong. Shoot. Anyways, and we will look to at the role that quantum properties in plasma might have had, not only in the development of superintelligence in the Kordylewski clouds and the development of quantum computers, but in human beings too. And that is the end of chapter 12. And I think that's what we'll wrap it up for this segment tonight. It's already 2.5 hours. Sheesh. Sad trombone. Sad trombone indeed.
What the hell was even that?
Apologies if that was too loud. Anyways, that's it for this segment. So hopefully see you in the next one.